years after the horrific discovery of 429 bodies in the Shakahola forest of Malindi in Kilifi County, the families are yet to get their bodies as they wait for the identification process. The followers involved of one Paul Mackenzie of Good News International Ministry, who had isolated his followers from the outside world, and anyone who was mingling was to be punished and not go to heaven. The followers were also instructed to burn all their documentation, including national IDs and birth certificate for their children. Now, the Malindi Sub-County Hospital remain with hundreds of unidentified bodies. Out of 336 DNA samples collected, only 66 have been identified and body claimed by their families. The families of the rest are still waiting for justice and for their loved one in order to give them a dignified burial.
Stephen Mwiti, a 47-year-old who was once a father of 6 children, ushers us into his rented room in Maweni village. On the bed are 2 pairs of school uniforms belonging to his children, who will have been 12 and 10 years had they not gone to Shakahola forest with their mother in 2022. These uniforms and their bags are the only memories left of his 2 children that he dearly holds on to.
Akaiba wale watoto mara ya kwanza alikuwa Samuel na Helen na Jacob. Akaenda akakundisha karibu na hapo kanisani, akatafuta nyumba huko. Akakaa huko kama wiki nikimtafuta, lakini katika ile kumtafuta nikaja kumpata mahali ameweka biashara za makaa, anachoma viazi, anashona, alikuwa mshonaji hapa nyumbani pia. Nikaenda nikamwambia, sasa wewe si uliamua kuja huku sababu ya kanisa ya Mackenzie? Nikachukua wale watoto wangu kawarudisha nyumbani wote 3. Nilipowarudisha akakaa siku ya kwanza, siku ya pili akaja akaomba msamaha, akasema na nimruhusu aendelee kuishi na watoto wake, haisiishi bila watoto wake. Sababu watoto walikuwa ni wadogo na mimi niliona siwezi fanya kazi nikiwa na hao watoto. Nikamsamehe akarudi nyumbani. Aliporudi nyumbani nikamwambia, sasa usiende kanisani tena ya Mackenzie. Tukaelewana. Akasema ni sawa, sitaenda. Lakini kumbe alikuwa anitaimisha.
Other children that had disappeared by that time were between the ages of 4, 3, 1 year and a few months old lastborn. She left 3 times. First time in 2019 to Furunzi, where Mackenzie's church was situated, but when she left for the 3rd time with her children in tow, she never came back.
2022 mwezi wa 8 tarehe 20 nikaenda kazini kama kawaida. Kurudi sikuta watoto nyumbani na yeye mwenyewe, lakini sikushtuka. Nilijua ni ile kanisa, ni ile imani yake imemfanya akimbie tena. Hiyo sasa ilikuwa mara ya 3 kutoka hapa nyumbani na watoto walikuwa washafika 5 sababu alikatanda wasa family, alafu yeye mwenyewe alikuwa mjamzito.
Initially through phone conversation, his wife told him she was in Langobaya doing farming before admitting that she had moved to Shakahola forest because of her faith.
Nikamwambia sasa itabidi anisaidie tujaribu kuenda kama tunaweza kwenda kwa wale watoto sawa ni wadogo, na kulikuwa na ukame na wale watoto wakiwa huko kwa msitu hawawezi kusurvive.
The search for a family of 7 people began.
Lakini nilipoonyesha Mackenzie na nikaongea naye, akaniambia hajaona watoto wangu na hawajui. Na hasa hizo story namwambia yeye hajui naongea kuhusu nini.
When he went to look for his children in Chakama forest, he saw several graves, and he was informed by several people that some children had started to be buried there.
Niliposikia kuna makaburi huko, alafu nikapiga ile picha ambayo nilienda kuona kule, nikasema wale watoto wangu maskini. sijui kama wako hai. Nilipotoka hapo sasa nikajaribu kutafuta msaada tena, nikaenda kuna ofisi kwa hapo, kwa chief, kuna nini ya watoto, nikaenda hapo.
Mwiti's heart sank when he saw the graves, but help from authorities was not forthcoming.
Kaenda Malindi police station, sikuja hata nyumbani sababu mimi mwenyewe nilikuwa kulingana na ile ukame ambao nilienda kuona huko na wale watu nilikuwa nakutana nao kule kwa msitu, nikawa na hofu, nikaona hao watoto wangu sijui kama wako hai. Sasa kutoka hapo sasa nilipokuja nikaja Malindi police station, nikawaambia, nikaingia hiyo room ya watoto, nikawaeleza vile ambao nilienda kuona kule, lakini kulikuwa na askari mwanamke. Akaniambia, wewe kama watoto wako walienda Shakahola na kuna wengine umesema waona huko, wako huko wanakona baba zao na mama zao, achana nao, wewe jaribu kuokoa watoto wako.
Pointing to a decoder which he says was the beginning of his misfortunes, he says the decoder became a window into Mackenzie's world as his wife got hooked on his sermons.
Shida ilianza na niliponunua Star Time, kapata kipindi inaitwa Time TV. Bibi yangu alikuwa mshirika wa Full Gospel, lakini alipokuwa anaangalia kile kipindi cha Time TV, siku moja kaniita, kaniambia ameona kanisa ambao hiyo kanisa anaona ni bora kushinda ile huwa anaenda. Kila nikiingia nyumbani anaangalia hicho kipindi, nikijaribu kumuuliza kwani kipindi gani huwa anaangalia, naambia kuna kipindi kizuri hapa ambao hiyo kanisa naona ni nzuri na nataka uniruhusu niende hiyo kanisa. Nikamwambia hiyo ni kanisa gani? Akaniambia iko hapa Malindi. Nikamuuliza hebu weka hicho kipindi. Alipoweka hicho kipindi, hiyo kipindi channel ilikuwa inaitwa Time TV, nikaona pastor anahubiri, anasema shule ni mbaya, ni mpango wa shetani, na hospitali ni mpango wa shetani. Wakaniambia ile siku Mackenzie alikuwa anashikwa katika ile operation ya kushika Mackenzie, kuna vijana 5 walishikwa kule kwa msitu na wako hii nini ya watoto iko Mayungu. Kwa hivyo kuna mtoto mmoja, mvulana mmoja katika hao wavulana 5, kuna mtoto mmoja anafanana na mtoto wako anaitwa Samuel. Wakaniambia sasa, wakatoa gari, tukapanda, wakanipeleka Mayungu, kaenda na ile picha, wale watoto wakafunguliwa, wakatoka, sikuona Samuel.
Despite repeated visits to follow up on the DNA identification process, only one child, Samuel, has been positively identified through a match by the Directorate of Criminal Investigations in 2023.
Tulifanya mwezi wa 5, 2023. Na mpaka leo hata hiyo mili yangu sijaipewa, lakini niambiwa mwili mmoja ulipatikana, lakini hiyo mili sijaipewa mpaka leo. Na nikipigia wale ndiseo na niambia hiyo process ni kama ilisimama, kwa hivyo itabidi tusubiri mpaka wa leo ambao tunaongea.
Each time Mwiti passes near Malindi Hospital, he is haunted by the thought of his children being among the 429 bodies still held up years later.
Hiyo kitu huwa inaniadhiri sana. Hata hiyo njia nikipita hapo, nikijua hao watoto wangu wako hapo, huwa nasikia vibaya, sababu walikuwa wamenipatia nikasika, pengine ningekuwa nimekaa hata kama sitasahau.
Getting closure is a distant dream for Mwiti since the process of identification and release of the bodies has slowed to a grinding halt.
Sababu mtu kama mimi tayari kuna mwili wangu mmoja ulipatikana, siwezi kubali waende waziko kwa pamoja na wale wengine, sababu sijui pengine wale wengine pia wako pale. Ile kitu ningetaka kusema, hata kama kuna wale pengine watakosa wenyewe, ama wale hawakutoa sample za DNA, watu wao wako hapo lakini hawakutoa sample, hao wanaweza kusikwa kwa pamoja. Lakini watu kama sisi ambao tulitoa DNA na tayari kama mimi kuna mwili wangu nimeambiwa uko hapo, ukiniambia waende ukasike kwa pamoja, utakuwa si picha mzuri.
Beyond the grief, the mental toll on victims like Mwiti has been overwhelming, and the trauma could last for years if left unaddressed. Dr. Janbibi Yusuf, a psychiatrist based in Mombasa, says unresolved grief, especially when a loved one's body is never recovered, can trigger post-traumatic stress disorder.
There's something called trauma bonding. Through a traumatic experience, you're bonded to the person that basically even gave you that traumatic experience. So sometimes for a family, it's hard to understand why someone won't leave. Like, hello, we've rescued you, you know, and yet you are still going on with the same thinking that was not right.
Mwiti's story is not unique, as only 66 of the 429 bodies have been positively identified and handed over to families. Despite the government collecting 336 DNA samples, many like Mwiti's are left in limbo, unable to mourn, unable to heal, and unable to move on with their lives. Mwiti's best friend Habel Nyundo has walked with him through every step of this experience. He was there when Mwiti first looked for his wife in Shakahola, when they visited government offices and local chiefs, and when they scored mortuaries for closure.
Tulipata tabu kumzunguka paka umpate. Ilikuwa ni noma. Naona vijiji vingi tu vya ukaribiana hivi. Kizunguka huku hayuko, kizunguka huku nirudi na huku.
He has been a pillar during his lowest moments. He says, for now Mwiti's life has come to a standstill as he cannot do anything because of this issue.
Uzuri, bibi yake huyu Steve alipatikana. Na akaulizwa watoto wako wako wapi? Sema sijui, walikimbia. Walikimbia vipi na ana mtoto mchanga na alitoroka? Sasa tunataka DNA ifanyike, tupate haki yetu. Kama vipi tupewe mifupa yetu tuzike, tuangalau roho zetu zitulie.
For now, Mwiti works as a night security guard at a certain establishment in Malindi, but Habel says he neither sleeps during the day nor at night, as the memories of his children still haunt him.
Hususan huyu rafiki yangu Steve, kila siku lazima nimpitie, nijue ameamka mzima, manake yeye ndiye aliathirika zaidi, manake yeye ndiye mwenye familia. Kupoteza watoto 6 si mchezo bwana. Tena jioni nimpitie nimuone yuko vizuri, manake ako katika stress nyingi, hajalaza watoto wake, na bado anajua ako mahali fulani, na bado uchunguzi serikali inafanya tu. Kwa hiyo kama inawezekana watumalizie issue, tujue tunafanyaje, na mwisho wa kuisha huyu Mackenzie atafanywaje, ili na sisi roho tulie. Hatufanyi kazi kila siku tunafikiria watoto.
Mwiti settled on the night security job after not being able to sustain several businesses he opened because of moving around in search of justice and closure for his children.
Wakati huo tukianza hizo changamoto, alikuwa anauza maji ya kupima na kuzungusha. Alipopata hizo stress akaona acha niache kazi, nikamtafutia kazi ya kuuza kahawa, ya kuzungusha na baiskeli. Alizungusha hiyo nayo akaja akawa inazidi kumshanganya. Saa hii nimempeleka mfuoni ajaribu kufanya kazi ya kulinda na usiku askari gongo. Hiyo ndio ina changamoto zaidi, manake usiku inkana kama anawaona kabisa wale watoto wake. Kwa hiyo itakuwa vizuri kama issue itamalizika mapema na yeye arudi binadamu wa kawaida.
As Mwiti continues to battle grief and uncertainty, mental health experts warn that the journey to healing is far from over. Without structured support, they say, survivors and bereaved families risk falling into cycles of trauma and deep social isolation.
So psychoeducation and supportive therapy for those families. I think communication is important, considering some of those cases were legal cases, so who knows where the holdup is. There are people who lost families, so we are talking about grief counseling, family members, grief counseling and so on. But definitely supportive therapy, and depending on the specific situation for that family.
The Shakahola massacre did unveil critical shortcomings in Kenya's public health and emergency response systems. The incident not only overwhelmed local mortuaries' capacities, but also highlighted systematic issues in managing mass casualty events. The Malindi Sub-County Hospital mortuary, with an initial capacity of 40 bodies, had to receive a mobile mortuary to help preserve the retrieved bodies. The 300-body capacity container was donated by the Kenya Red Cross Society as a stopgap measure after the hospital authorities raised the red flag of a mortuary's capacity to hold the bodies being retrieved from the Shakahola forest. Dr. Edin Walong, a pathologist and lecturer at Maseno University, explains that the identification of victims in such complex cases requires rigorous scientific protocols, including DNA sampling, forensic anthropology, and dental records.
The most common is the fingerprint technique. So the fingerprints are taken of the deceased person and matched with a medical record, not a medical but a civil record. For example, if the individual took a passport at some point or has had an ID, or they have an ID, then their fingerprints were taken. The other primary source is the DNA. DNA is viewed as gold standard for certain, because of its certain characteristics, that DNA of an individual is established and is not shared with other individuals. And if well characterized, it provides a measure where comparison is easier to perform. But there are also other ways, other approaches. The third one are the dental records. Each individual has a unique dental pattern, and with a good X-ray or CT scan of the jaw and teeth, then you can identify an individual based on those records.
The lack of a national policy for mass casualty management further complicates the process. Dr. Walong says for a situation as complex as Shakahola massacre, international standard by Interpol to be used is disaster victim approach because it is detailed and is standardized globally.
So Shakahola would qualify to be handled as a disaster victim identification process because of the mass fatalities. And the disaster victim identification process, as defined by Interpol, it has 4 distinct processes within it. And the first one is a scene. So the scene has to be processed through a standard approach. And this being a scene where they have to perform multiple exhumations, and there's an approach to identifying each individual victim and where they are and processing each exhumation through a standard checklist. The second process now will be the post-mortem examination or the autopsy. Now, when activities at the scene are complete, then the bodies are placed in tamper-proof body bags, labeled, and taken to a mortuary. Specimens are taken in for testing in the laboratory, and the specimens are submitted to the laboratory for 2 reasons. One, to provide the profile for identification, especially DNA, and the second is to determine the cause of death.
According to the World Health Organization WHO guidelines, as bodies decompose quickly, especially in warm climates like in the case of Kilifi County, which has relatively warm temperatures, they should be identified soon after recovery. Bodies should only be released to relatives once a formal identification has been made and a formal handover document, such as a death certificate, provided. Dr. Walong insists on the importance of proper and safe body handling so as not to interfere with the DNA identification process.
So what is important is that the bodies have been properly handled from the site to the mortuary, and the storage is above board. What happens between the scene and the autopsy at that point should mainly be containment. The body is in a body bag that is locked. If it's taken to a mortuary, then it's in a mortuary cabinet that is locked. And the only time that the body is reopened is at the autopsy. And we see that in most of our disaster victim identification processes, this discipline is lacking.
WHO further advises only in rare cases can the mass disposal of unidentified bodies be justified? Burial is the preferred method, as the other methods destroy the evidence for future identification. Bodies should be buried 1.5 to 3 meters deep in marked graves and following local customs and traditions. Communal graves should only be used in case of an extreme disaster.
We expedite the investigations. We expedite also the work that is being done by the government chemist in terms of investigations and scientific evidence that is being extracted.
A report by the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, KNCHR, monitoring findings of the Shakahola tragedy, titled Mashaka ya Shakahola, cites the main causes of death were starvation, strangulation, head injury, and dehydration. It further recommended the release of the bodies to their next of kin for burial and closure. However, this report and that of committee by Senate, which released their report in October 2023, did not highlight the handling of the bodies in case of mass death, exposing a gap there. Dr. Walong adds that in Shakahola massacre, a gap is seen, and that could be why the process is taking long.
I'll be curious to know whether the autopsy includes detailed photography of each case and detailed sampling of each organ and their description, and application of histopathology, the laboratory techniques that confirm the actual death, and other laboratory techniques that will identify whether individuals had been poisoned and so on.
Dr. Walong suggests for a transparent process, which the team involved could be giving information to ease the grief and the whole process of identification.
My recommendation will be that the lead teams, or the teams that are leading this process, should provide more information to the public about their progress and about their challenges. We know that Kenyans are enterprising, and some Kenyans would be happy to provide donations in kind and other donations that can help the process move along. We know that there are certain laboratories such as KEMRI who also run human genetics and human identification laboratories, and they will be happy to come in and support from a technical perspective. And in terms of when now we consider payment and resources for that, I know Kenyans are good at mobilizing such resources.
Matthew Shipeta, a human rights activist from Haki Africa, was among the first responders and volunteers who assisted in rescuing the victims in Shakahola.
The identification process is the biggest blunder. That's where we have failed, because the failure that has taken us over 2 years to identify bodies and match them with their family members is the biggest failure. There are many excuses. The government chemist is saying they do not have reagents and they were not expecting such type of a massacre to have happened, so they were not prepared. But it has taken them over 2 years. If it is buying the reagents for DNA sampling, they should have bought those reagents. Kenya is not a bankrupt country.
This is not the first time where Africa lacks a policy in handling and disposal of bodies in mass death. Dr. Walong adds that Kenya can learn from other countries which have experienced such disasters and the technology they use in mass death for victims' identification and mass burial.
We have many examples. Argentina has experts, and they have experience with brutal dictatorships before, and a lot of the guidelines that emanate or are within the disaster victim identification manuals from their experiences. We know that Israel has had a lot of challenges in security, but they do a good job in identifying individuals and reconciling with their families. We've had Asian countries describing or dealing with earthquakes and other natural disasters with high death tolls, and they have pioneered certain techniques of mass storage. Some of them involve temporary burial, and there is precedence to that in closer home within Africa. We've had pockets of success. For example, the handling of Ebola victims in West Africa, although that process was more of containment, quick, safe and dignified burial without much involvement of the forensic service.
The handling of large number of dead bodies can have a serious impact on the mental health of not family members, but also the recovery team. The effects can take a variety of forms and may occur immediately after the event or much later.
Ningepewa hiyo mili yangu, hata kama itapatikana hiyo mmoja, kama hiyo nyingine itapotea pia, sababu nasikia pia kuna makaburi mengine ambao pengine hayakufukuliwa bado yako huko. Kwa hivyo ile kunipatia ule mwili wangu pia itakuwa ni bora zaidi kuliko kwenda kusika pamoja.
So it's not unusual for this process to take long. Usually, some of them do take quite a long time and it's resource intensive. But what is important is that there has to be some flow.
The need for stronger religious regulation is critical, as the absence or mistrust of formal institutions creates a vacuum that charismatic cult leaders like Mackenzie are quick to exploit. Professor Halim Shauri, a sociologist and deputy vice-chancellor at Pwani University, says cults often thrive where there's deep social despair, poverty, and mistrust in public institutions.
You know, the whole question of cult or cultism is a question of compliance to a doctrine, compliance to a belief, compliance to a practice that many people get involved in, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes knowingly.
He explains that when people feel powerless or hopeless, they are drawn to charismatic figures like Paul Mackenzie, leaders who offer them a sense of meaning, structure, or salvation.
When people are faced with economic challenges, they tend to find for an exit. And normally the exit is religion. Because even in the words of the founding fathers of sociology, like Karl Marx says religion is the heart of the heartless, and religion is the opium of the masses.
Professor Shauri supports revisiting the proposed Religious Organization Bill of 2024, originally tabled by Tana River Senator Danson Mungatana.
The religious space is not regulated, and it is surprising for a world which has reached 21st century, or for a country which has 63 years since it attained independence, and it doesn't want to regularize or regulate religion.
The bill emerged from recommendations by the Shakahola Ad Hoc Committee sought to rein in unregulated religious groups. It proposes hefty fines of up to 5 million shillings in fines, 3 years in jail, or both for anyone running unregistered religious organization.
I know the government has made an attempt through the Mungatana bill, if you're aware, but the Mungatana bill has been dropped. So I would advise that people need to go back to the Mungatana bill, pick what is good in the bill, and tease out what is not good in the bill, so that they can do some reforms or adjustments to what is not good, or they can remove what is not good, but at least the religious institutions must be regulated.
Building societal resilience against destructive cults, Professor Shauri says, requires more than just regulation, and it demands community education, interfaith dialogue, and strengthening of local governance. We reached out to the Ministry of Interior and National Coordination for comment, but had not responded by the time of publishing this story.
The tragedy of Shakahola is not about the mass loss of life, but the prolonged suffering that the government is subjecting to the families, to their loved ones. Without clear information from the government, the family will remain in a cycle of grief, mourning, and heartbreak as they beg their government for compassion and form of justice so that they can get back their loved ones. For Willow Stories, I'm Asha Bekidusa.